Good evening and welcome to Wildlife from the Wildlife Trust for March 2022. And we've got a cracking discussion for you tonight, all about making access equal. We all understand that we need to have a right to nature. We all understand how critically important nature is for our physical and mental well-being. And the government has said it wants to improve opportunities and quality of life for people more evenly across the country. Surely that should also relate to nature, because there is strong evidence that accessible, nature-rich spaces improve people's physical and mental well-being and even reduces mortality. And yet in the UK, there are huge inequalities, particularly impact disadvantaged communities, some of which have little or no green space near their home. So as the Wildlife Trusts, we call on government for a legal right to local nature with other health and environment charities as part of the Nature for Everyone campaign, which we'll hear a lot more about tonight. We're going to dig into the issues behind this with our panel for what's sure to be a thought-provoking discussion. And we've got a brilliant panel to really dig into these issues tonight with you. We have tonight joining us Lisa Witham, who's lead for the Green Prescribing for Mental Health at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. Lisa, thanks for joining us. We have Maya Rose Craig, founder of Black to Nature and ambassador for the Wildlife Trust. So pleased you could join us, Maya Rose. We have Pete Lau, who's Wildlife Support Officer at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and founder of Accessible Nature UK. And we have Richard Benwell, who's Chief Exec of Wildlife and Countryside Link, who we're working in partnership with on the Nature for Everyone campaign. Now, we were going to be joined also by Rhiannon Fetinukin, who's the award-winning social activist and founder of Black Girls Hike UK. And unfortunately, for family reasons, she hasn't been able to join us last minute tonight. But we are going to see a video from her a little bit during this discussion and hear more about her work. So let's get cracking. Let's get straight into it. And the first discussion tonight, the first sort of panel member that we want to hear from is Richard Benwell, who's Chief Exec of Wildlife and Countryside Link. As I was saying, Richard has sort of got a long career in working around these kind of issues. He's been policy advisor to Secretary of State at DEFRA, led policy and advocacy work at both Wildfire and Wetlands Trust and the RSPB, and served as director of Westmill Solar Cooperative, and even as a clerk in the House of Commons Commission. So Richard, so pleased you could join with us tonight. And Richard, first of all, kick us off. Tell us, I know it's shocking to believe this, not everyone might necessarily know what Wildlife Countryside Link is, so tell us about that. And tell us more, of course, about the fabulous Nature for Everyone campaign. Richard.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for having me tonight. Link is a coalition of green charities. So there are 65 of us, all sorts of charities from the brilliant Wildlife Trusts and the National Trust and the RSPB on the big end of the scale, to some of the smaller charities like Wild Justice and Bat Conservation. And we all work together to try and make the world a greener one. And we're really pleased to be working with you for Nature for Everyone at the moment.
Tell us more then, Richard. What is it you want from this campaign? What is the campaign about? What's it really trying to deliver?
So it was the levelling up agenda that sort of kicked this campaign off. We heard the government saying that they wanted to even out opportunity and quality of life and pride of place up and down the country. And that sounds a brilliant promise, but it strikes you when you hear that it's impossible to have those things. How can you have pride of place? How can you have equality of opportunity? How can you have equal life chances if the moment you open your front door, those things are compromised by the quality of your natural environment? I mean, we know that that's true in all sorts of different ways. We're focusing on biodiversity today, but just think about the sort of ill health that comes from breathing polluted air, or the inability to access beautiful blue places and clean water. And access to nature is absolutely fundamental to making sure that people can enjoy those things about the wonderfulness of the world that they live in, and enjoy the health and well-being benefits of getting out in natural places. So the campaign is all about saying to government, if you mean it, if you're serious about this idea that everybody should have equal opportunity no matter where they live, then fundamental to that has got to be making sure that the third of us who don't have access to quality green space within 15 minutes of home have that remedied, and that we have a decent standard of access to nature for everyone, no matter where they live, a right to nature.
Absolutely.
I thought it was interesting, Craig, that you said that we sort of all know that we need a right to nature in your introduction there, and that's if you ask somebody, should we have a right to nature? I bet most people will come back and say yes, but somehow we've sort of let it be normalized that that's not true, and these disparities that we sort of take for granted as we walk through a city, from from Walthamstow to Westminster, you get different amounts of access to green space depending upon your cultural and ethnic background, depending upon socioeconomic status. We've even got it built into our language. We call posh places leafy places, don't we? And it's just normal that we assume that those disparities are there. We think it shouldn't be normal anymore, and it should be a legal duty for government to make sure that everybody enjoys that right to nature.
Great, thank you, Richard. Well, the whole point of Wildlife is, of course, is that you can ask questions to panel members live, and we've already had over 50 questions come in tonight. So I'm going to fire one straight to you to kick off, Richard. We've had Jamie Perry has asked, how can the wildlife trusts, and I think that would go just as much for all other sort of nature organisations across the UK, communicate the importance of transitioning our supporter bases to a more culturally diverse and representative group of supporters to its core members, whilst empowering them to be at the heart of this welcoming transition? What's your thoughts on that, Richard? You sit there in the epicentre of it all with Wildlife in Countryside. I think you hear from lots of different of the big nature charities. What's your sense about that, about how we can, diversify our supporter bases?
This has to happen in all sorts of different ways. I mean, we need to first of all diversify who we are, and to make sure that as a movement we are welcoming and inclusive in every respect. So it's about ethnicity, but it's also about gender, it's also about socioeconomic background. And at the moment, for a movement that prides itself on being on the cutting edge of creating a more progressive and modern society, we've really fallen behind on that. And that's something we're trying to get a grip on, and we're looking hard at ourselves and thinking about, what are the changes we can make, the simple things, recruitment practices, different ways of advertising, different ways of talking to people that can help us change internally. But when it comes to reaching out to more people and inviting them to be part of the movement, well, there are lots of different, you could read technical manuals about inclusion and diversity till it's coming out your socks, but actually I think the Wildlife Trusts have got it when you guys just spread the joy of nature. And actually I think the main thing we can do to widen our pool of supporters and make sure that everybody can enjoy things is just show the love. If one of my earliest, happiest memories of an interaction with the RSPB actually was coming across them in the place that we called Pigeon Park in Birmingham. It's a little patch of grass, and there the RSPB were with a telescope pointed to the top of Birmingham Cathedral, saying, "There's the peregrine," and it was grabbing people in as we went. All sorts of folk, people on their way to work in the middle of Birmingham, kids like us just sort of hanging out in the park amid the pigeons, and everyone. And it was the enthusiasm of the folk who grabbed us that made the difference. And so for me, that's still the way to do it.
Great, Richard Benwell, thank you very much. And you taught me a new phrase there, reports coming out your socks. I've not heard of that one before, but I quite like that. I rather like that. So I said we were also going to be joined by Rhiannon Fitanukin tonight, who is founder of Black Girls Hike. And unfortunately, Rhiannon, last minute wasn't able to join us for family reasons. So just to say a little bit about Rhiannon, she's an award-winning social activist, passionate about inclusion and community development. And she's the founder of Black Girls Hike, a non-profit organisation that provides a safe space for Black women to connect with nature and explore. And that's spearheading a movement to diversify the outdoors. So sadly, we don't have Rhiannon joining us tonight, but we do have a fabulous video about Black Girls Hike, and let's have a watch of it now.
Tanika, the founder of Black Girls Hike, and we are here in the Lake District for our Lake District Weekender. Black Girls Hike is an organisation I founded to challenge the lack of representation and inclusion of black women in the outdoors. It's just about creating a safe space where we can reconnect with nature and explore. This weekend in the Lake District, we've done some climbing, we've done some kayaking and canoeing, we have done some hiking, some yoga and some wild swimming, and we've had women from all across the country come just to kind of like experience the Lake District, and everyone's having an amazing time. Let's go!
Diversity is quite limited actually, and so finding these groups that now exist, I feel that it's really important that the spaces that we're now appearing to take up, that we're becoming more noticeable. And also within my daily work as a yoga teacher, I feel it's really important that there are people that look like me, that represent the people that I want to come to my classes. So when I go to schools, children actually are fascinated that the teacher looks like them and that my hair is the same. So it's just the small things. It's important that we're noticed.
Really easy, really light, and the vista is brilliant, refreshing, reviving and therapeutic, and that's what I like about it. I think that's the word, therapeutic.
Yes, please.
To anybody thinking about joining Black Girls Hike and attending some of the events, I would say do it. And I would say come here and be unashamedly you, and know that this is a safe space and there's no judgment, and this is about empowering each other to be our favourite versions of ourselves and be true to ourselves. So do it, come, be you, have some fun, meet some incredible women and do some really amazing cool things.
Isn't that a fantastic video? Although I have to say, when I watched it, I did find myself thinking it looked a bit chilly up there in the Lake District that weekend, but absolutely amazing to see that. And if you want to know more about Black Girls Hike, my colleagues are putting the link in the YouTube chat now, so do make sure you have a good look at that and find out more about it and look at their website. You know, fantastic initiative from Rhiannon and colleagues there. So let's move on now to Lisa Witham, who's head of Wilder Communications at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and Lisa leads on their wellbeing, engagement and volunteering work. Now, Derbyshire Wildlife Trust is a partner in one of the 7 national test and learn pilot sites to improve mental wellbeing through green social prescribing. Lisa has over 20 years experience of working in the voluntary sector on community projects and has recently been involved in working on a program to improve wellbeing in urban areas. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I know already from the questions that are coming in, there's a lot of interest in what you're talking about tonight. Just kick us off. Tell us, what is green social prescribing and why do people need it?
Okay, thanks, Craig. Well, social prescribing in general is focusing on what's called personalised care. So it's looking at a kind of holistic range of interventions to help someone's health and well-being. So that could be all sorts of things. That could be loneliness, finances, things like housing. So we're focusing on the green element of that. So we're encouraging health professionals to advocate for outdoor activities to improve people's mental health. So as you say, Derbyshire is one of 7 across the country, 2-year funded by DEFRA test and learn pilot sites where we get to try out some things and make sure that green social prescribing is embedded into the health system. So we're talking to health professionals, we're talking to link workers, and we're talking to referrers to sort of prescribe outdoor activity really as a way of improving health and well-being. So we know that there's an absolute wealth of evidence from conservation charities, from mental health organisations and from academics that being in blue and green space is really good for your mental health. And obviously I think quite a lot of us experienced that during lockdown. We discovered places nearby to us that we'd forgotten about, or we discovered new places on our doorstep that sort of post-lockdown, really, there has been a huge increase in mental health referrals, particularly around young people and young adults. So really, this is a kind of way of addressing that. These pilots are a response to that, really. So we're working on how to embed nature into our everyday lives.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. We've had a lot of questions, as I said, coming about this. Fiona Moore asked, how can we persuade people and the medical services that connection with nature and ecotherapy can be a viable alternative to pharmaceutical interventions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one of the big topics that we're working on. So it's about sort of working with health professionals to get them to understand what some of the activities are. So what forest bathing is, what forest schools are for adults, what bushcraft is, so that they've got a real understanding of, when they're referring someone to that, what kind of activity and what kind of benefit the person will get out of that. And we're looking a lot at appropriate referrals as well. So making sure that the right person's getting prescribed the right activity. So I think there's some work to do. I mean, there's going to be a central repository for all of these reports and all of this information that we know, that we've been sort of saying for years, that we know this is good for you, being outdoors. So I think it's about making sure that health professionals feel confident to refer into it, and making sure that green providers are also confident that they can deliver these activities, and making sure that they're sort of they have enough capacity and resources really to take on more people for this green social prescribing.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And Jill Feenan has also asked, as a small landowner, what is the best way to facilitate or encourage access to our land, either casually or as a resource for green prescribers?
I mean, there's lots of great providers out there that you could link up with. So there's lots of, it's quite interesting because some of the very small organisations that we work with, they don't have all of the resources they need. So they're working out of very, very small bits of land. So if someone does have some land they could use, that would be a great connection. We find that there are small providers that they don't get the opportunity to have sort of somewhere fixed. So they can't run a programme. And because they can't run a programme, they can't get the evidence they need to show health professionals of the benefits of this. So actually, I would say, either link up with an existing provider or start talking to health professionals about setting up some kind of green provision on your land.
Great. And last one for now, we'll come back to many more later on, but Lindsay Emily, or maybe it's Emily Lindsay, I'm not sure, has asked, how can someone get into green social prescribing work?
Well, there's a huge push at the moment for social prescribing link workers. So there's been money to fund link workers in primary care settings, so in GPs, but also in the voluntary and community sector. So, we have some brilliant wellbeing volunteers, and we also have some amazing health professionals who are advocating for the sector. So if you can join the link worker network, then you can, brilliantly advocate for green provision. That would be excellent. We'd love that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. Well, we'll be coming back to you, obviously, for more discussion in the Q&A, but thank you so much for kicking us off there on green prescribing. Our next panelist is Pete Lau, who's founder of Accessible Nature UK and also a wildlife support officer at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. Now, Pete's life changed forever after a life-threatening mountain bike crash led Pete to becoming paralysed from the chest level down. But now fully dependent on a wheelchair for mobility, Pete began to come to terms and adjust to this new harder norm. And having always had a love for wildlife and our wilder places, Pete began pushing the boundaries of what he could achieve in a wheelchair, and then designed and started Accessible Nature UK, and has so far written over 75 guides to wilder places. So Pete, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, and tell us a bit about the barriers you've encountered to accessing nature as a wheelchair user. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Pete.
You got me now?
Got you now, yeah, great.
So prior to March 2014, my life was very envious from a lot of people's perspective. I had a very successful career in the fire service and took part in many outdoor activities mountain biking, road cycling, hill walking, running, climbing. Yeah, you name it, I was doing it. But my main hobby was scuba diving. And in fact, strangely, you get a reminder on social media that 8 years ago to this day, I was actually snorkeling with 40 wild dolphins in the Red Sea, you know, which was an amazing thing. My accident was very serious at the time, life-threatening with very serious injuries. And if it wasn't for the NHS, then I wouldn't be here today. And of course, the wonderful facilities that we've got with air ambulances. Almost a year I've been in hospital. And as you can imagine, the sort of coming to terms with an injury such as mine and the paralysis and the change that would create, you start to reflect back on what you've done in your past. Now, I was very lucky, really, to have done so many activities, but I didn't realise until that reflecting period that actually, whenever I did an outdoor activity, it was usually an interaction or observing nature that was the most memorable part of that event. And so really that's where I then looked at how I could actually re-engage with wildlife and get back out. Now, I wasn't an experienced wheelchair user. I'd never had much to do with disabilities. I was very lucky in health. But all of a sudden now, bang, I'm now paralysed from the chest down and dependent on wheels. So that massive urge to rediscover was what drove me to get out and about and look at what I could achieve. And I have a dog, an assistance dog, and I have to get out despite any sort of inclement weather. I have to get out with my dog Merlin to give him exercise. And then it was then trying to research information about where you could go in a wheelchair. I wasn't prepared for all the barriers that you're going to come across. Obvious ones like a stile or steps are not doable in a wheelchair or mobility scooter, but it was more the presence of such things like this A-frame that you can see behind me here, which, you know, predominantly where I live on a housing complex, these sort of structures are commonplace throughout the countryside and throughout the urban environment as well. Obviously put in place to prevent antisocial behaviours with people on off-road motorcycles, quad bikes and so on. And I do appreciate that, you know, it's difficult for local authorities to police these areas, but by a sort of default action seem to be to install this sort of device or even put rocks across to prevent motorised vehicles going into a space. And actually they're now sort of precluding people like myself who are dependent on wheels getting out and about and enjoying ourselves. So, you know, literally I could go out my door within a 10 or 15 minute roll. I have a powered attachment on my wheelchair and I'll bump into one of these and that's as far as I can get. Wildlife for me, why is it important to me? Well, I use nature and distraction. I suffer a lot of nerve pain. And so as a previous speaker mentioned there about the benefits to health and well-being, I can fully testify to the benefits, certainly to myself. At the time of my accident and throughout my recovery, I was on very strong painkillers, but these had a knock-on effect of causing me to almost live in a fog. And so I took the decision to try and come off these medications. And that's when I really got into wildlife photography. And going out and sitting by a riverbank or, you know, in a wilder place, trying to take a photograph of the kingfisher diving down or an otter or something like this, really uplifts you. It doesn't have to be something exotic as a kingfisher or an otter. You know, any sort of interaction with wildlife is a massive bonus, and I use it as a distraction to take my mind off the sort of pressures that I've got and improve my mental health and well-being. So as I said, it can be even a small step it can be a barrier. You know, a small step to some people with some equipment can be like scaling Mount Everest. You're just never going to get past it if you're relying on wheels for mobility, sadly. So yeah, that's where we are. That's why we started to discover these places, and then it struck me actually. You know, what a great waste it would be if I didn't capture the information that I was finding. And when I'm trying to research a place to go, there wasn't the in-depth information available that I could access, which would be written by somebody who's got a really good understanding about issues affecting somebody with limited mobility. And And so that's why I created Accessible Nature, to try and share that information so that other people in the comfort of their own homes, before they go to a location, can assess whether or not that information, that venue or site is going to be suitable for them.
Well, you've received a fair lot of attention about this work. In fact, you even had a BBC report on it. So let's watch that now.
Finally this evening, a former firefighter who took up wildlife photography after an accident is creating a disability guide to some of our region's most beautiful outdoor spaces. And these, aren't they stunning, are some of his amazing images. And now Peter Lau from Huddersfield is sharing what he learns about the places he visits to help other people with disabilities and the access to the countryside. Sally Hurst reports.
Wildlife photography takes Peter Lau all over the country, discovering beautiful outdoor spaces like here at RSPB Oldmoor near Barnsley, capturing nature at its finest.
The outdoors, for me, since becoming paralysed in 2014, has been a lifesaver. Laid in a hospital bed for almost a year, striving to get back out and try and... I see it as almost trying to reclaim a little bit of the old Peter Lau back, in that you get out into the open and you're doing something that you did before in a different way. And certainly through lockdown and prior to lockdown, it's been absolutely my saviour.
But accessing the countryside as a wheelchair user has its challenges.
I never really thought about disabled access prior to my accident, because you just take it for granted. But when you suddenly find yourself dependent on wheels, then an adverse camber on a path, a step, even a small step, can be a barrier.
Now Peter has started a website to help other disabled people access the outdoors.
On his website, Accessible Nature, Peter writes detailed descriptions of routes, including key information like blue badge parking, whether ramps are available and the condition of the ground. It means other disabled people and their families can plan and enjoy a day out in the great outdoors.
Over the past few years, nature has nurtured Peter's soul, and now he wants others to experience the calm, joy and peace that being outdoors can bring.
I can just sit down here on accessible paths like we've got around us today, and there are so many around that I've found, and just observe nature come to me. I mean, listen to that. We've got a lovely bird singing behind us. What more could you ask for? It's such a beautiful thing to be able to do.
Pete, that's a fantastic report. Well done. What a brilliant way of getting profile for the issue you're working on, the work you're doing. So congratulations on that. Questions coming in. Pete, there's a question from Benny Lai. It says, what is being done to help wheelchair mobility chair users access nature? I mean, in your conversation there, Pete, you told us a lot about what you've been doing and trying to, document which sites are better than others. But I mean, do you feel that there's any kind of sense from the government or from others to try and improve this situation, or not really?
No, you don't feel as though there's any sort of main steering group taking it forward. I'm quite verbal when I go around in a respectful way. But if I do come across an issue at a venue or a site or a location, usually I'll approach the landowners or managers of that site. And it may well be that somebody's not actually brought it to their attention before, and they'll look for a way to try and rectify the issue. A typical one was a nature space at a motorway service station not too far from where I am, and they put a grid in to stop sheep coming through and deer, but unfortunately when they put it in, it caught your wheels in a wheelchair. So we really did appreciate the fact that somebody brought to their attention politely and just said, could you not look at changing this? So no, you don't feel as though anybody's really driving it forward, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a real shame, isn't it? Well, it clearly needs some real attention and a real effort to drive this forward. So maybe that's something we can discuss as the night goes on. So, Pete, thank you so much for talking to us about such an incredibly important issue there, really critically important. And I think you've kicked us off very nicely on that. So our next panellist tonight is Maya Rose Craig, founder of Black to Nature and ambassador for the Wildlife Trusts. Maya Rose will be known to many of you, I'm sure, because he has reached quite a high profile through her work. She's written many thought-provoking pieces about nature and diversity in the conservation environment sector. Written a book, I should say, as well, haven't you, Maya Rose? Fantastic book. And founded Back to Nature to encourage more children and young people from minority ethnic backgrounds to engage with the natural world and conservation. I should say also she's Dr. Maya Rose, Craig, which is pretty impressive given you're in your first year at university, aren't you? And you're a doctor already. But of course, you're awarded an honorary Doctor of Science from the University of Bristol in 2020, and quite right too as well, Maya Rose. So tell us a little bit more, Maya Rose, about your charity Black to Nature. How did you set it up, and tell us about the work it does?
Yeah, I mean, so I set up Black to Nature in 2015, which I was 13 at the time, and I think it very much was just born of my own experiences. Like I'm very much an outdoors person. Both my parents are bird watchers, hence why I'm also very into birds. I spent my whole childhood outdoors, engaging with nature in the outdoors. But it was at this age that I started to become very aware that I never really saw anyone else who looked like me, who wasn't white, out in the countryside, and that actually the outdoors was an extremely white space. And I think as a kid, that made me really sad. Like I loved being outdoors, and I really wanted to share that with other children my own age. And so I started running nature camps, weekends away, the sort of activities that I would want to do if I went on something like that. And I just sort of threw it all together. And I started bringing children from the local city, Bristol, and bringing them out into the countryside. And I think at the time, there weren't very many active conversations around race and lack of diversity in environmental spaces. And I think something that I really distinctly remember is there were lots of people online telling me, there are just certain groups of people who can't connect with nature and the outdoors. And I was quite young, and I sort of had this moment of like, oh gosh, what if they're right? What if this is all a disaster and it's all going to go terribly wrong? And then the very first camp I ran with Black to Nature, it was fantastic. We had this group of teenage boys who rolled up, and they were like, oh, don't want to be here, don't like going to, never been to the countryside, didn't think they're outdoorsy people. By the end of the weekend, they were having an amazing time. They'd gone like bird ringing and held wild birds, and they'd gone like, wading through rivers and playing football and, fields, all that sort of thing. And they'd had an amazing time, and they'd engaged with nature. And I think that's the moment that was a massive turning point for me, when it went from being like, just a simple, I am someone who loves the outdoors and I want to share that experience with other people, to realizing that there was something much more structural, much more ingrained, preventing people from ethnic minority communities coming out of the cities and engaging with nature in the outdoors. And from then, Black to Nature's been campaigning on that issue ever since.
So, and tell us a bit more. Why do you think, historically, that we've ended up in a situation where the access to nature has become so unequal?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for ages about, people immigrating, needing jobs, ending up living in very inner city areas, all that sort of thing. But I think regardless of, the more intricate details of history and people's own personal families and things like that, I think a lot of the issues that we're discussing in general, like, it boils down to the fact that in the UK, access to nature, the countryside, the outdoors, is a privilege. And it is something that has historically been reserved for a privileged group of people. There's a reason it's seen as a very middle class, upper class, white pastime, and it's because that's who it has been for traditionally. And I think that all the work that all of us are trying to do is to break free of that history and to I suppose evolve to a point where everyone is able to access these spaces, which we've already discussed is incredibly important for various reasons. And I think the really interesting thing is, though, because of that history, a lot of the children and the teenagers, or just the communities that we're working with, really think of themselves as urban people who belong in the city. They don't belong in the countryside. They see it as a very alien space where they feel very unwelcome, basically, like they don't belong there. And so a lot of the work that we do is just trying to break down those assumptions and show that actually, no, this is a really enjoyable space to be in. If you do have the time to like go for, you know, a day out to the local national park or whatever, you'll have a really good time. And I think we did see some of those barriers coming down in that, you know, that very first wave of lockdowns where suddenly the parks were all shut and people were like, hang on a minute, we would actually quite like to be outside. But at the same time, I would really like to reiterate, you know, this isn't just a cultural issue. There are very tangible things that we're dealing with. You know, there are lots of people I talk to that, for example, literally can't afford to go out to the countryside because they don't have a car, and, you know, there is no public transport, or public transport is really expensive, or, you know, you talk to people who, you know, there's a very cultural fear of dogs, and so they refuse to take their children anywhere where there are dogs running around because they're really scared of them, you know. So there's lots of different things that we're working through at the same time. It's a very layered issue, which I guess is why it hasn't already magically been solved.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was going to ask you about that. You said you started Back to Nature when you were 13, and if I can hazard, let me guess, are you about 18 now? Is that right?
19, yeah.
19 now, right. What sort of progress do you feel has been made in the last 5-6 years? Do you feel there has been some progress, or not at all? Or how do you feel progress is being made, or not?
I think the fact that this is an event that is happening shows that progress has happened. Because I think it wasn't something that I even really thought about as being strange at the time. But when I first started, there was a very adverse reaction to the issues that I was talking about and the things that I was campaigning for. I think people thought that even suggesting that there was discrimination or racism within the sector or environmental spaces, I think that really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And I think that, so one of the biggest changes has been that in the past few years, I think people have really come to acknowledge that it's obvious that there are really big issues to do with diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and that actually something really needs to be done about it. You can't just sit by and hope that eventually these issues will solve themselves. And it sounds small, but I do think that will make a really big difference, because it's only from that point that you do see organizations starting to, you know, run conferences, start projects, you know, give organizations funding, things like that. So I do think change has happened, and I do think that that's a really big deal. But obviously, there is still such a long way to go. And I think, again, we did see that during the pandemic in terms of accessibility. But I suppose, yeah, I think the fact that people are willing to change and do the right thing, I think that is very significant.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I mean, massive congratulations on what you've achieved, Maya Rose, over the last 5-6 years. I mean, you really have done a huge job in raising this issue up the agenda, and so huge congratulations on that. And I don't think anyone would think that it's anything like done yet, nothing like, but you certainly helped kick this off. So hugely important job, and thanks so much for joining us tonight, and delighted that you're an ambassador for the Wildlife Trust as well. Thank you. So we've had some great comments coming in. Dawn O'Malley has responding to that film of yours, Pete, said, I loved the sentence in the BBC piece, nature nurtured his soul. That kind of hit home for Dawn. Andy Roberts has said, I can fully endorse the good that nature brings after attending courses with the Green Light Trust, a non-for-profit organisation which offers support in Norfolk and Suffolk to those in need. Keep your comments in, many more. We want to try and get through them tonight, and also to the questions. But first of all, before we go into the wider panel discussion, I said I'd throw a poll at you. You always enjoy these on Wildlife, so it's going to pop up now in the YouTube chat, and please give us your answer. The poll question is, how far do you have to go to access nature? And you've got one of three choices: on my doorstep, or 5 to 10 minutes walk away, or only accessible by vehicle. Please vote now in the poll, and we'll give you the results as soon as we can. So let's take that poll shortly and look forward to hearing about that. So let's get into the kind of conversation now a little bit more. I mean, what did all of you, hearing each other here tonight. What did you find? What are the themes that resonated from you? What did you sort of hear each other kind of almost repeating, but in slightly different ways? What screamed out at you as you heard each other discussing? Who wants to kick off?
I think we're all hitting on different issues, but actually the issue is the same. In that, you know, awareness is going to be the key to this, and engagement with people who can make things change.
I think also, like, one of the really interesting like shifts that I see that we've been talking about a bit today as well is that, you know, I think historically these nature organizations have always been seen as, you know, nature organizations about, you know, the outdoors, the countryside, things like that. And I think increasingly they're seen more as organizations for people, which is what they are, and that link between people. And I think that shift that we've all touched on today, of it being the job of these organizations to reach out and bring them to nature and be, yeah, like I said, be that link towards between nature and people. I think that's going to be incredibly important going forward.
Richard.
Well, just to notice one thing that we haven't spoken about yet, which is that part of the problem here is that there's less nature. And it's worth saying that, really, because most of us are focused on sort of access to the countryside and going to nature, and that sort of historical sense of sort of who owns England, who's able to get out there, whose footpath is it anyway. It's all about going to some Garden of Eden elsewhere. And part of the problem here actually is that the abundance of nature has declined so much. I was reading some numbers about this this week, because we're about to set targets for restoring biodiversity, and the sort of start of the index that we can really measure back to well was 1970. And compared with 1970 levels of species abundance, we're at 17% now. I mean, that's an extraordinary loss in 50 years. And it's small wonder that actually people are struggling to get equal access to nature if it's disappearing from around us. Mm. So a big part of this agenda has to not only be opening up the countryside and dealing with those barriers to people getting out there and enjoying it. It also needs to be bringing nature back to us and ensuring that there are no places left bereft of nature around you. So that's another side to this too.
Yeah, so that it's not a sense that nature's sort of distant and you've got to travel a long way to get there, but it's sort of all around us. It's next door nature even. Absolutely. Lisa, what resonated for you out of hearing your colleagues on the panel tonight?
Yeah, I think it's really similar to Richard's point, actually. I think we've been doing a wellbeing project in Derby City. So we've chosen two wards in Derby City, which are two of the most deprived wards. There's a lot of segregation, there's a lot of different languages spoken. And so what we've been trying to do is make nature as accessible as possible, literally on people's doorsteps. So we've been delivering things to activities to voluntary and community groups, and we've been working in the local park. And it is about, you know, even though there are parks, they're not very well used. You know, there's some fantastic green space in Derby, but they're not very well used. There are issues around safety and security, and like you say, just lack of knowing the rules of how to be out in nature. So I think the idea that we bring it to people's doorsteps is absolutely key. I think it's about those small actions, and obviously the Wildlife Trusts have got the Next Door Nature programme, but that kind of idea of that, getting people to do things really, really locally, because it cuts down the transport, it cuts down the affordability, and it makes things really, really accessible for people.
Yes, well, Lisa referred to there the Next Door Nature programme from the Wildlife Trust. We announced this last week. You might have missed it because there are one or two other things in the news at the moment, aren't there? But we're delighted that last week we announced that Wildlife Trust has received £5 million from the National Lottery Heritage Fund to fund community organisers right across the Wildlife Trust, one in every single Wildlife Trust, to really help communities engage on this issue and to try and deliver next door nature, to try and make nature much more accessible to communities. So what we'd like to know, we've got our thoughts at the Wildlife Trust on how we need to go about that, but let's hear from the panel. You know, Ruth Allcroft has asked the question tonight anyway, how do we best get communities engaging with this issue? So Maya Rose, you tell me, what's your sense? What's the best way to get communities really engaged with this issue at a local level?
I mean, gosh, I think that's the fun thing, though. There are so many different ways to engage with communities. In terms of the work that I've been doing, like part of the reason I think it is so important to engage with kids and teenagers in particular is because it is very much the next generation. And I don't think that people have any reason to care about nature-based or environmental issues if they've never experienced nature or the environment. And I think that there's very much a risk of people seeing these issues as, you know, being a white liberal concern for people who don't need to worry about anything else. And so I think just taking people out in some shape or form is excellent in terms of making them care about environmental issues. And I think getting them while they're young also is very, very effective. But on a broader level, I think there's also this assumption for a lot of people that nature's a bit boring. And I think like something I see sometimes is I think because we all have so much knowledge within the nature sector and we're always so desperate to share it, I think sometimes it comes across as being very scientific based. So I know lots of people, for example, we do bird ringing things where, you know, we're showing people bird ringing and, you know, people love showing, you know, the average length of a wing or the scientific name of a bird and things like that. And it's like, actually, no, these kids are excited because they're seeing a live animal in front of them and they just want to see the bird. And so I think like making nature interesting and fun and relatable for people. And I think also finally, like in terms of engaging people, I think, which I've totally been doing this tonight as well, we always talk about nature about like as if it's in the countryside. The only place you can find nature is if you venture out of the city miles away from your house. And so I think like increasingly something I'm really interested in is focusing more on urban nature and urban wildlife. I know so many amazing nature reserves that are in cities. I know so many amazing parks in various cities that people can visit and see nature in the outdoors. And I think that, you know, that would make a massive difference in terms of reminding people that there's stuff right on your front door. But yeah, I think in terms of all environmental issues, reminding people that they are both connected to nature and in fact part of nature, that human beings are animals too, I think is always going to be a plus.
Absolutely right. I wholeheartedly agree so much with everything you said there. I mean, you know, even at times in my life, I've found parts of the nature community sometimes quite intimidating. You know, the suggestion that if you've got the slightly wrong pair of binoculars or the slightly wrong jacket, you're not part of it. And I think there's so much we can do to just make it, open it up a little bit more. And it doesn't matter if people get the species name wrong. In fact, it doesn't even matter if people don't even care what the species name is. Some people will want to understand the ecology and just appreciate nature in a broader sense rather than necessarily or identified everything down to the last Latin name. So I think we've got to really understand that. I think that's so important. It's also, I'm not very good at the Latin names myself, so that's why I will say that. Pete, what about you? What's your thought? But what's your sense about how we can get communities engaging with this issue, and particularly people, you know, with restricted access as well? How can we sort of open it up more widely in that community?
So the main failure of organisations that I've come across is not engaging with communities to find out exactly what their needs are. For instance, I go to so many lovely nature reserves, and there'll be a viewing screen, and the viewing portals are, you know, for somebody who's sort of 5 foot to 6 foot, and there might be some low down which are sort of for children, but if you're in the middle in a wheelchair, then there's not a lot you can see really. And you know, I think it's vital to find out who your potential user groups are going to be and what parts of the community they belong to, and then reach out to them to say, come along and tell us exactly what your needs are, so that we can modify what we've got to make sure it best fits everybody.
Yeah, absolutely right. Richard, what would you add to this?
Thanks, Craig. I mean, we mainly talked about the sort of share the love bit on this, and Maya's right. If you can get the experts sort of showing you cool stuff. It can help enthuse everybody. I was grinning because I reminded myself of an awful show of social incompetence a few years ago when I texted Matt Shardlow, the CEO of Bug Life, on Christmas Day, I think it was, to say, "Oi, Matt, what are these bugs that are coming out of my Christmas tree?" And he'd replied in seconds. The enthusiasm of the true enthusiast is just utterly infectious and brilliant. But just on this question of community engagement, I think one thing that we can do as activists, as environmentalists, is just to remind people that it doesn't have to be this way. And the assumption that nature's for somebody else, that a developer and a planner has more power to say that it's going to crush your bit of ancient woodland and leave you disempowered about saving that little bit of green space that you've relied on, or the assumption that it's got to be for Peter to go out and tell somebody that he can't get to green space instead of it being automatically thought of at the planning stage. You know, these things, they don't have to be that way, and we can change the system by campaigning. And that's why, to come back to the idea of a right to nature, getting it as a legal assumption in law that all local authorities, all transport departments, all public authorities have to think about these issues so that we can level up access and level up the assumption that everybody can enjoy it. I think that's a really important thing for communities, and sometimes getting people enraged about the fact that they don't have the power to protect those bits of the green space that matter the most to them is something that we can do to change the mindset that actually nature is just always going to be fading away. No, it's not. And we can make sure that we really can deliver nature for everyone if we all tell the government that we're demanding it.
Absolutely right. And if you missed it, we had a wildlife just a couple of months ago on the whole story about local communities fighting to protect nature on their doorstep. It was an incredibly inspiring episode of Wildlife. So do make sure you catch up with that on look out for catch up on the Wildlife Trust YouTube channel if you want to know more about that. Lisa, you're head of wilder communities at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. So I've got to put this question to you that Ruth Allcroft asked. How do we best get communities engaging with this issue?
Well, we go out to them. We stop telling them how to do things and we go out to them. So we co-design programs. We've been co-designing a wellbeing program for the last year with voluntary service users of voluntary and community organisations. We ask them what the issues are, what the barriers are, which is exactly what we're doing around the green social prescribing, talking to people with lived experience and finding out their views. And we break down some of the barriers that we've put in place as well. We should stop calling things nature reserves, things like that. You know, it's difficult. Like, I'm not from a conservation background either. I don't know the Latin name of anything. And when we finished our wellbeing project, when we were designing it, I was like, I don't want anyone to know the Latin name of anything. It's all about nature appreciation. It's just about feeling like you're part of it and feeling that you're comfortable and it's welcoming to you, and it isn't this kind of, you know, special club that you're not part of. So yeah, we have to get more into the communities and start designing things together, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Lisa, great stuff. There's a bit of a theme about Latin names here, isn't there? So I suppose I should say they have a value as well. I just need to say that, otherwise I'll get clobbered next time I go in the office. But no, very good. Absolutely right there, Lisa. We need to make sure that we are welcoming. We don't turn people off with that kind of language. Absolutely. So we polled you a little while back with the question, how far do you have to go to access nature? And here are the results from the poll. 60% of you, very luckily, said on my doorstep. Isn't that amazing? 37% said 5 to 10 minute walk away. And only 3% of you said that you can only access nature with via vehicle. So you're a pretty lucky bunch in that you have pretty easy access to nature. Watching wildlife tonight, which actually doesn't surprise me really. And this is, in a way, it emphasizes the issue we've got, is that we know that a lot of our kind of audiences for events like this and Wildlife Trust membership and so on will be many people who have easy access to nature. But what is so important to do is for us to be able to reach out beyond these kind of audiences. Much as we love you, of course, we do love you very much. But it's really, I'm sure you all agree, it's very important we reach beyond these kind of audiences that are privileged to have access to nature on their doorstep and to reach others as well. And that's what so much we're talking about tonight. As Lisa just said, that means it's very important that organisations like the Wildlife Trust go to such communities, engage in the conversation around that. We'll be giving another poll shortly, so do look out for that. We've got many more comments and questions coming in. Thank you so much for those. We've had Prue Reynolds that says, brilliant to hear about your work, Maya Rose. Many congratulations. How can I get in touch to find out more? I would say Twitter, wouldn't you, Maya Rose? You're pretty...
I was also about to say Twitter, yeah.
Pretty prolific on Twitter.
I think Black to Nature's working on a lovely, beautiful website at the moment. So that might pop up if you Google us, but honestly, just message one of us on Twitter or Instagram, because we're always looking for people to get involved. Thank you.
Great, exactly. Michael S. has said we need to engage the hard to reach people, council estates, local youth schemes, and the vulnerable. Absolutely. Johnny Cook has said, hi everyone from Leicestershire. Great conversations. Many thanks to the panel. And Michael S. says, yes, this lady is talking sense. Lived experience is valuable. You can decide which of you ladies that was referring to. I think you can decide for yourselves. We've had a question come in from Paul. Paul from Harwich Friends of the Earth, and really I've got to take that. Paul, very nice for you to be joining us tonight, and hello, I hope you're very well. Paul has asked the question, are there any websites that can be recommended to read more about green prescribing? And we have shared on the YouTube chat the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust webpage and the Leeds Beckett University report that we did in conjunction with the Wildlife Trust on that. But in a moment, I'll ask any of you else to say if there's any. But Paul also had a question, said Richard Benwell mentioned that even our language amplifies the issue of access, for example, leafy suburbs. Do you feel a better national curriculum could change the narrative? Who wants to kick off on that? Maya Rose, you've said a fair bit about that education in the past, haven't you, around these kind of areas? Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think that it is incredibly important that we have more nature in our curriculum. I think that it's absolutely been stripped from it. And I think it's linked really to a wider issue of, I suppose, school being so stuffed full of, I suppose, what's seen as the bare essentials to pass exams, that there's no wiggle room for children to do anything else. I know that when I was in primary school, one of my favourite things was forest school. I loved doing forest school, and it was great for the kids, especially who maybe struggled to sit still a bit in the classroom and things like that. But I found out a few years later they'd had to reduce that down to only class 1 because the rest of the kids in primary school were too busy preparing for their exams, which I think, you know, we're talking about like 8-year-olds here. I think that that sort of symbolises a much wider issue going on. I would say, however, though, in terms of, I know that there's still lots of discourse around the natural history GCSE, might cause a bit of a ruckus, but I personally don't support that, just because I think that that adds into the wider thing of making nature into a niche, especially if it's one that, you know, you have to choose to do in order to learn more about it. And so I think instead what would be amazing is if we had more about nature and the environment and environmental issues spread throughout our, you know, throughout school in lots of different subjects, the sciences, geography, history, even things like that. Because I do think that, you know, lack of education absolutely ties into lack of knowledge about these things. And I've heard about some really, really lovely projects working with particularly schools in very urban areas where it's just taking kids out to like the local park, the local allotment, things like that. And it's things that they've literally never had the time to do before because they're so busy studying. But yeah, no, I absolutely think we need more nature in our education systems.
Richard, do you think that would help?
Definitely. And It's exactly that. You have to build it in as part of the fabric of the curriculum, as well, I think, as doing specific things. I would love a natural history GCSE, but it shouldn't be a standalone. It shouldn't be compartmentalized. And, I think that will attract into the profession people who care about it too. I guess part of the reason I'm sitting here today is because of Mr. Porter and Mr. Lampard, who took me out birding. I was the only boy on the Friday afternoon bird watching option, and it was just a delight. So these things are really important, but education doesn't end at school either. I think it's worth saying that groups that help teach people about the natural environment, community groups that take people on bat watches and night under the stars, and right up to the University of the Third Age. These are all really important ways to educate people about the natural environment, and we shouldn't be too careful about the way we do it either. I don't know if any of you saw the thing that came up a while ago about part of the geography curriculum, I think it was, where there was a page asking school children to put the arguments for and against climate change being a thing. And there was a sort of discussion underneath it that said, some people think climate change is happening. Other people think it might not be. And we shouldn't be in this period of equivocation about it. Climate change is happening. This is how you fix it. There's the interesting science. Ecological emergency is happening too. And we should be, in a way that doesn't terrify our young people, really clear that this is an issue that everybody needs to be part of solving.
Great. Well, look, I'm going to throw another poll at you all because you rather enjoyed that first one. So I'm going to throw another poll at you. It's coming up on the YouTube chat now. The question we want to put to you is, do you identify with any of these barriers to access to nature? Number one, I don't feel safe. Number two, there's too much antisocial behavior. Number three, there's no green space near me. Or number four, nature is not for me. So the poll will be opening right now. Please do pop in your vote and answer that if you identify with any of those barriers to access to nature. And while people are putting their answers in the vote there, I want to put this question to you all, because Lewis Carr has asked the question tonight. It says, when we talk about barriers, we often think about physical barriers first, like how close green spaces are to home and how they can be accessible to people with disabilities. Obviously, this is hugely important, but what about the psychological, social and cultural barriers to nature, like feeling safe in green spaces? How can we overcome these barriers? Lisa, you're nodding there. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem, isn't it? It's one of the things that we talked about. It's about making people feel comfortable again, and about sort of encouraging nature to be relevant to everyone. So it's whatever part of nature you enjoy and whatever part of nature is good for you, then you don't have to, you don't have to do that at a nature reserve. You don't have to do that on a long walk. You can just do that going to the shops and back. You can do that in your local community. So I do understand that's one of the issues that we come across when we're talking to people, particularly in urban wellbeing programs. And there's other barriers, as in not having the right outdoor shoes and coats. And there are many other barriers apart from the fact that it just isn't nearby to you. It's this idea of sort of social capital. You don't really know what to do there, and you don't know what the rules are. We've done quite a lot with families in the past, where we've spoken to families that don't take their children out to the local parks, and it's because they're not really sure if it's, like you say, safe and comfortable, and they don't really know if they're allowed in certain places or whether places are excluded to them. So it's an awful lot of education and awareness work, I think, that we still need to do out there to make people feel like nature is for them. Definitely.
Yeah. Pete, I'm interested, Pete, in your experiences. I can envisage that it could be that sometimes the sort of physical barriers that you were talking about earlier in some reserves actually can almost conspire with the psychological barriers and the issues we're talking about, cultural barriers, and they kind of conspire together to make sites, particularly hard to reach or not very welcoming for certain groups in society. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly for my position, going from being probably a very little, well, I wouldn't consider myself to be vulnerable in any shape, way or form prior to my accident. All of a sudden now I'm a person who's quite severely disabled by anybody's standards, and now feeling quite vulnerable. And actually getting out into the countryside or getting to a wilder place, or even going to a local park, you do feel as though, you know, you're very self-conscious, very aware of being a vulnerable person. So yeah, it is an issue. And then, of course, if you do get to an open space and there's a barrier there, then you're almost failing at the second hurdle. The first hurdle has been getting out the door, and the second one is when you get there, you can't make any progress, and that is so frustrating, especially when it's a barrier that doesn't need to be there. You know, there are so many gates in place which don't need to be there. You know, and that's the issue.
So real world physical gates and perhaps psychological gates as well.
Yeah,
or cultural, societal gates. Yeah, absolutely. And Maya Rose, your experience of this, do you find that sometimes they can all conspire, the physical and the cultural, as it were?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, when did the very first bit of research, like asking people, why aren't you going, you know, into green spaces, into the countryside, something that popped up over and over again was just this feeling of it not being a space for them. And lots of people talked about it feeling very alien, very unwelcoming. But also something that popped up quite a lot was people's fear of experiencing racism or even being hate crimed if they ventured out into the countryside. And in terms of the work with Black to Nature, one of the things that we're trying to do is, you know, just show people that actually being outdoors is a really positive experience, and maybe this is something you want to do again or go back with your family and things like that. And I think one of the most upsetting things that can happen on one of the camps that we run one of the weekends away that we're hosting, is actually when those negative assumptions are proven true. And we have had instances where people, especially actually with the teenage boys, where people have come up to them with the assumption that they are causing trouble, that they're making a ruckus, that they're disturbing the wildlife, when they're doing no such thing. A lot of the time they are simply stood in the countryside or in a nature reserve trying to enjoy the nature, and people think that they're troublemakers. You know, we've had people threaten to call the police on a couple of lads playing football in a field and things like that. We've had people several times come and like tell them off, essentially just for existing in these spaces. And so I think that is something that's really important to acknowledge. Actually, there is this fear of the countryside being a space where, you know, ethnic minority people don't belong, but not all of that is in people's heads, and sometimes that is proven true. And so I think there is absolutely work to be done on the other side of things, of actively making this into a welcome space and pushing that I suppose assumption that the countryside is for white people into the past and moving on. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge.
Yeah, hugely important. Richard, anything to add on this, in particular in terms of sort of the wider campaign? I mean, we're getting a lot of conversation tonight that's going to be very relevant for the campaign, aren't we?
We are, but I guess some of these cultural questions are more fundamental, and they speak to a different problem, don't they, than the ones of improving access in law. And they're ones that we all have to search our hearts to make sure that we're not continuing to perpetrate any of these things, and try to make sure that we're as welcoming as possible. Is there a role for government in making change there? Well, there might be. We're not in the space of sort of behavioural change and nudge theory, but we should be in a space where ideas like right to roam, that they have much more in Scotland, is extended. You could do that in parts of England without sort of ruining farms or betraying private property, and that could help people to know that they actually have a right to be somewhere. I'm sure that there's more that the government could do about establishing improvements in countryside code and other messaging like that to emphasise that actually this is a space that's everybody's to belong to. And so yeah, there's definitely a role for government there, but it's mostly one about searching our own hearts and making sure that we know that we're behaving in the right way and being as welcoming as possible, even in those precious nature reserves.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we've had brilliant comments coming in tonight. Thank you very much. Frank Friedman has said, to promote access to local urban nature, we need to involve any organisations who are fighting for pedestrians first in society, less cars, good public transport, speed limits, crossings, for example. Noel Vernon on the education subject said an integration of all the key curriculum subjects into an outdoor education approach would be a good starting point. It means that educators need to be trained. And on the same issue, Paul Watson says, education in this country is utterly broken and really doesn't support our communities and population at any real level. It needs a complete overhaul. I should say, of course, we did do a previous Wildlife looking at education, around education and nature as well. You can find it on the Wildlife Trust YouTube channel. And in fact, it was one of those that had thousands, tens of thousands of people watch it. So do make sure you catch up on that. It was a particularly well-liked one, that, and I think it was about a year ago. So make sure you have a good look at that. And we talked about the potential for natural history GCSE in that. Michael S. has said, I'm self-taught, but I was intimidated by the impression I had to be part of a certain kind of people. I think that's in terms of natural history. So echoing some of the points that were made here. And Joni Cook has said it's important to emphasize the health and well-being benefits of access to nature on the doorstep, particularly in light of the pandemic. And we should get the results of the poll coming soon. It's closing very soon, or has just closed, so make sure you ask those. Prue Reynolds has also said multilingual staff able to reach a wider group of communities, work with schools and early years settings, family groups, so on, are very, very important as well. So another couple of really important questions here that came in that relate sort of to policy issues. Veronica Jones said there are obviously problems in the planning department at County Hall. I think she means in London, as detached houses are going up on green land at an ever increasing rate. Why are they allowed to build on green land and so many detached properties when we all know the less advantaged members of communities are still waiting for affordable homes? Plus, they have greater need for benefits for access to nature nearby. And Diane Timby has said Portsmouth has limited green space, and Tipner Peninsula, this would be, is one of them. What is the latest on Tipner proposed development? How can we persuade the government that green space status trumps any further discussions about developing the land? Well, this is a really important part. You know, right across the country, wildlife trusts are fighting still to protect some of the very best bits of nature, whether it's Tipner down in Portsmouth, on the Portsmouth Peninsula, which I went to last summer. It's a fantastic site, former Ministry of Defence site, and the idea that you now build houses on it, by the way, at sea level, doesn't make much sense, does it? And just a week or so back, I went to Swanscombe Peninsula in North Kent on the Thames Estuary. And again, guess what? At sea level, it's designated last year as a site of special scientific interest. And now, of course, you've got a development proposal to put a massive new theme park right over that site of special scientific interest. Again, right in a tidal, in an estuary, is subject to tidal surges. Doesn't make much sense, does it really? Some people are just not reading enough about what's going on in the world, I think. So let's talk a little bit about that there, that the very fact that, you know, this Richard, you were saying earlier that, of course, access to nature, you've got to have the nature there to have that access. It's not just perhaps the biggest barrier to access to nature is if nature doesn't exist, and lots of people are seeing nature, and sometimes even some of our best sites still being lost in this country.
Absolutely. I mean, it's completely asymmetrical warfare out there, isn't it? I mean, the chances of a community being able to successfully defend against a determined developer are getting slimmer by the day, and it's so sad to see the way that the planning system is developed. There's something in the planning system called a presumption of sustainable development. Have you come across this? This is what happens if a local authority hasn't allocated enough housing for its area to meet the government targets. Then you get a presumption of sustainable development. For us, that should mean a presumption of sustainability, looking after nature. What it actually means is that you can pretty much presume that you're going to go ahead and give planning consent. This needs to change. And I don't want to read out a little manifesto to you, but it's time that we took the bull by the horns with the Planning and Levelling Up Bill and said what we need to do to turn this around. And just to give you a couple of ideas, let's put nature's restoration as a statutory purpose of the planning system. The planning system isn't there to build houses alone. We must do that, but it's not just about that. It's about how we use our land. So let's have restoring nature as a statutory purpose along with net zero of the planning system. Let's make sure that there is an obligation to protect all of our remaining precious wildlife sites. We've got SSIs over a part of the remaining semi-natural habitat in this country. Let's complete the network. And let's make space for nature to recover. Hopefully the Wildlife Trust's people out there are cheering at that prospect, because of course we need a wild belt or a nature improvement area or whatever you want to call it, so that you can make sure that those precious places and places where we can bring nature back are properly protected. Those would fit with a statutory right to nature to give you a real chain of responsibility down from the top of the planning system, saying this is what it's for, through protecting what we've got left, making space for nature to recover, and ensuring that you don't forget the individual, because we must never leave any individual or community behind about this. It's got to be nature for everyone. That's what we should see from the government in the Planning and Levelling Up Bill, and it would make a real difference to those questions that we've just heard about.
Great, thank you very much. Maya Rose, I saw you nodding away when I was having my little rant there about green spaces still being lost. This is still a huge problem, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how much I can respond to Richard, really, but I think, it's the thing that we keep on saying throughout the night. We're talking all about connecting people to nature, taking people into the outdoors, but at the end of the day, we're running out of nature. And that's what a lot of this does boil down to. And I think it is very cyclical, in that the less nature we have, the less people are inclined or feel the need to maintain what nature we have left, which I guess is why conversations like this are so important.
Yeah, Pete, I can well imagine for wheelchair users, sometimes people's for wheelchair users, that one of the favourite nature sites might actually not be necessarily recognised as a nature reserve, or it might be somewhere close to where they live, and it could be what might be called a brownfield site, and actually, very often it will suddenly disappear under a building site.
Yeah, I mean, I worked in the fire service around Bradford. I know Bradford really well, Huddersfield and Leeds, major cities of the north, and yet all I see when I drive around is more and more green fields being turned over to detached housing. And I've often thought that there's an imbalance there, because there are so many derelict brown grade sites or ex-industrial sites that are ripe for development, and in actual fact are closer to sort of the city centres and to amenities. And so if developers could be sort of given some sort of incentive to try and develop those areas, then that in its entirety would also reduce people's carbon footprint, because when they're going into town, they're literally walking into town rather than getting on a bus or driving a car. And so it seems to be, it needs a real look at as to how planning departments allow people to build on greenfield when there are so much in ex-industrial sites which are just going there laying dormant.
And Lisa, there must be an issue for you working with sort of wilder communities. That I'm sure in your part of the world, in Derbyshire, you're still seeing sites sadly getting lost at times.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you say, it's great when local communities do champion behind a cause, and we've had some brilliant successes around local groups who have really fought their corner, and they've had some great successes. But it's disheartening when you're trying to get people out into nature, as Maya said, and then the nature's diminishing. So you need to encourage people to love their little patch, really, which is the heart of what we're talking about, isn't it? It's something really local to them that they feel really strongly and really passionate about, and that's what we're trying to encourage.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lisa. Well, we polled you a short while ago. We polled the audience tonight. Do you identify with any of these barriers as barriers for getting out into nature? We asked one question: nature is not for me. And near 0% of you said that. But again, you know, this is not necessarily a representative audience tonight, but, you know, nonetheless, encouraging, I suppose, that none of you felt that nature is not for you. 3% of you said there's no green space near me. But 43% of you said there's too much antisocial behaviour. That acts as a barrier for you getting out to nature. And 51% of you said, I don't feel safe. So that's astonishing, isn't it? 51%, I don't feel safe. 43% said there's feel there's too antisocial behaviour. So there's a real common sort of thread there that people just don't feel safe one way or another, sometimes in getting out into some sites in nature. What can we do, I wonder, to try and ensure people feel more safe in nature? What if are people sort of aware of sort of tips or things that have worked to deal with that? The perceived risk of some sites. Lisa, have you sort of had experience of that, about what can be done to try and make sites feel sort of safer to communities?
It's certainly an issue that we come up against, particularly in some of the parks in Derby. It's about people not wanting to go out on their own, and like you say, not feeling particularly safe in certain areas. I'm not sure I've cracked it. I don't know if I've managed to solve it. We tend to do things with existing groups, so we take them out as a so if they're a service user of a voluntary or community organisation, then they come out as a group first of all, so that they familiarise themselves with the site, and we try and work with the local communities there and make sure that people do feel as safe as possible. We've got certain areas, wildlife areas, where they're sort of community gardens and community allotments, and people feel a lot safer in those spaces, I think. But it is a really tricky subject. Yeah, it is difficult, especially in urban areas. You know, sometimes that is actual, you know, they genuinely aren't safe. Sometimes it's a perception, and sometimes it's about sort of education and awareness and making people feel more comfortable so that they would go out perhaps as a small group, perhaps, rather than going out as an individual.
Thanks. Any of the rest of you had a sense of that? How can we make it feel safer to people to go out into nature?
Certainly in Huddersfield, we had a real problem with one of the larger parks in the city centre. In fact, it was becoming a bit of an area where antisocial behaviour and lots of terrible things were happening. And certainly what the local authorities did there, they engaged with the local police and neighbourhood policing team and increased the presence for a period of time, which then actually uplifted the park, because people started to return to the park and felt it was a safer environment. And that seems to have worked in that area down there. I mean, it's a very well-used park now with lots of people. And I think it becomes self-perpetuating. The more people who go to a park and then feel safe, they'll return to that park again. And so, you know, it's almost, it becomes like a bit of a movement, doesn't it, about people's claiming it back as a nice place to be.
Very similar actually to people cycling as well, is that the more people that cycle, the safer it feels to cycle, and the more people cycle. Quite extraordinary. Well, we're down into the last few minutes now. We've almost completely run out of time. So I want to put a final question to you all, if I can. And it's a big question. You might need to think about it. But as we close, if you could have a magic wand, okay, and wave a magic wand, who would do what over the next 5 years to make a really big difference on this agenda, please? So which organisation, which whatever organisation, I don't know, government or public body, something like that, or individuals, who would do what to make a really big difference and fast track movement on this agenda over the next 5 years? Richard, let me start with you.
I'll be told off if I don't do the campaign answer. So the campaign answer, which is true and right, is that the Secretary of State for Levelling Up should make sure that when he brings his legislation in, he includes a statutory duty on all public bodies to provide equitable access to nature for everyone in the Planning and Levelling Up Bill. That would make a huge difference, because it would drive local authority action. They always put it least in the priority list because it's not a duty. It would empower communities to know what they want and what they can ask for. And it would make sure that when we make those day-to-day decisions on planning and spending decisions, that people's need for nature is built right into the fabric of it. Sneaky little one, because it's boring to talk about secretaries of state. The other little bit of the magic wand is let's us all do it too. And let's all be that person on the corner of Pigeon Park pointing out the peregrine to somebody. You may make people think you're mad, but it does really bring delight, and it might just inspire someone. So let's go up and down.
Right, thank you very much. Lisa, if you could wave a magic wand, who would do what over the next 5 years to make a big difference on this agenda?
Well, I'd like to see the Wildlife Trust, but I obviously think we do, but I think there's an awful lot of work we can do, and there's a lot more advocating and a lot more campaigning that we can do on this topic. I suppose with my sort of green social prescribing hat on, I'd really like to see health commissioners really thinking about how they fund green social prescribing and making sure that they really sort of put more emphasis into embedding that into their work and making sure that there's a real sort of sustainable model for green providers to be able to deliver lots of their activities, because a lot of voluntary and community organisations and green providers, they have very short amount of funding, and there isn't sustainability to design a programme around that. So we need to think longer term about how we really embed it. If we think, 1 in 5 GP appointments is for non-medical issues, we could save NHS and health and social care an awful lot of money by changing things.
Great, Lisa, thank you very much. Pete, if you had a magic wand, who would do what on this agenda in the next 5 years to make a big difference?
I think this would firmly fall under the Transport Secretary's jurisdiction. In fact, first of all, you should make it a law about all these airframe type things and things on public access spaces that are outlawed and taken away, removed, with a better solution, what's tested for that community that it's meant to be serving. And secondly, I think that the Disability Discrimination Act is widened so that it includes real good teeth in a law where open space is covered by it. Buildings are covered by such legislation, but sadly a lot of open spaces are not. There's a guidance or there's a best policy, but it's not legislation as far as I understand.
Great, Pete, thank you very much. And Lisa, Maya Rose, I should say, if you had a magic wand, who would do what over the next 5 years to make a big difference on this agenda?
I mean, I suppose it's not a very interesting answer, but I suppose one of the key things is just putting diversity and accessibility at the core in terms of the priorities of various organisations, in terms of where we're going forward. That means in terms of thinking about where money's being spent, thinking about towards whom projects are angled, things like that. I think that's how you make a big difference, rather than, I suppose, sidelining these issues and occasionally being like, oh wait, no, we care about diversity and accessibility as well, we should probably add something in there. So I think that's incredibly important. On a more personal level, I'd love to see, I think, more government investment into green spaces, especially urban green spaces. We talked briefly about how the difference between the quality of green spaces is so great that you can literally tell, it literally is based on class and things like that. You can tell how posh or not the area is by how nice the green spaces are. And so I'd love to live in a world where our urban green spaces are far more prevalent, far more interconnected, and of a far higher quality. And I think a really cool side effect of that would be also that there would be more animals and birds and things like that also moving into our cities. But yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, I have to say a huge thank you to all our panelists tonight, to Peter, to Maya Rose, to Richard, to Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you are really inspired by this conversation tonight, and I'm sure you must be, obviously make sure you get involved in the Nature for Everyone campaign. There's a link to posted in the YouTube chat now to sign a petition in support of the Nature for Everyone campaign. And also we're inviting you through that link to take part in the green in the grey photos. You'll see the link posted in the YouTube chat on that. So have a good look at those and enjoy those, and follow our social media at the Wildlife Trust and also Wildlife Countryside Link and other organisations over the months ahead to see how you can get more involved in the Nature for Everyone campaign. Critically important for us to try and get the Secretary of State to do exactly the thing that Richard was talking about there. That will be hugely important. So follow those. Also follow our social media feeds for more information about the next wildlife in April. That's coming together nicely. And we've got a really great one coming up in May as well with a very special guest I'm excited about, but I'm not allowed to tell you at the moment. But quite an exciting name. I'm looking forward to that a lot, that one, for May. So keep a good lookout for those as they happen. I also just want to make a comment that you might remember wildlife last month. We looked at rewilding, and we were looking at rewilding across Europe, and we had Misha join us from Rewilding Ukraine. And he was joining us live from Odessa that night. And we knew things were getting pretty tense, but of course it ended up being that evening that Russia invaded. And I thought you'd like to know that I'm pleased to say that Misha and his family managed to get out of Ukraine and get to Romania safely about 3-4 days after the wildlife. So they're now in Romania and safe. So I thought you'd like to know that. That's not true of all the employees of Rewilding Ukraine. And in fact, of course, there were staff and volunteers from many environment organizations in Ukraine at the moment that are facing unimaginable horrors. So, I mean, I think it's worth saying tonight that, of course, our thoughts are really with all Ukrainians, but of course, particularly those friends of ours that we know across the environmental movement in Ukraine. And there's a huge environment story to this appalling invasion as well, which is getting some publicity, but perhaps not enough at the moment, because ultimately that all impacts on communities as well. So maybe we'll end up talking about that at some point in the future. But I thought if you saw last month, you'd want to know that Misha, who was on our panel, very pleased to say he got out with his family into Romania and they're safe. So really it just comes to me now to close this evening and say again, huge thank you to Maya Rose, Richard, Lisa and Peter for joining us. Thank you also to you for joining us tonight and asking all those amazing questions and comments, so many more than we had time to get through, but I tried to get through as many as we possibly can. Thank you so much. See you next month. Good night.
Thank you.